She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just stood up in a room ruled by fear and formality, and said, "I'm hungry." In that instant, the courtroom's pulse stopped. Judge Gregory Harlan, infamous for his cold rulings and zero-tolerance courtroom, was about to hand down a life-altering decision. But one sentence from a child shattered decades of walls he'd built around his past. What happens when the justice system meets the one thing it can't control? Human emotion. And what secret has Judge Harlan been hiding behind the bench all these years? The courtroom's atmosphere was as icy as the marble that lined its walls, a space where emotion was not welcome, only evidence. Judge Gregory Harlan sat at the bench with the stiff posture of a man who had long ago buried the softness in his voice and the warmth in his eyes. His reputation preceded him, uncompromising, ruthlessly efficient, a man who saw compassion as a luxury the law could not afford. On this frigid Monday morning, the air crackled not with tension, but resignation, as another custody battle unfolded under his severe gaze. The case was particularly delicate. A 6-year-old girl named Eva, caught between a father who claimed he wanted her and a system that didn't seem to know what to do with her. The mother was long gone, disappeared after a string of arrests and failed rehab stints. The father, Thomas Granger, had been largely absent until recently, now pressing for full custody, citing a changed life and new priorities. Yet, he spoke more to the judge than to his daughter, whose tiny frame sat huddled on the bench beside a caseworker too busy scrolling on her phone to notice the child's blank stare. Harlan adjusted his glasses and scanned the documents in front of him, ignoring the subtle tremble in Eva's posture. She wore a pale blue dress 2 sizes too big, and her shoes had no laces. No one commented on her appearance. It was standard fare in family court. Thomas's lawyer launched into a well-rehearsed speech about redemption and second chances, detailing his client's recent employment, stable housing, and completion of parenting classes. Across the aisle, the court-appointed guardian raised objections, pointing out a history of neglect, unpaid child support, and an unwillingness to visit Eva until custody became a possibility. The courtroom was not a place for grey areas. It ran on black-and-white narratives. And Harlan liked his narrative simple. He didn't ask Eva how she felt, didn't glance in her direction as the adult sparred over her future like she was a possession and not a person. Fluorescent lights buzzed above as the stenographer typed rhythmically, capturing every cold exchange. The bailiff stood near the exit like a silent statue, trained to remove disturbances but not to question the proceedings. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but inside this room, time crawled. The judge asked perfunctory questions, occasionally tapping his pen in frustration when answers meandered. He didn't like inefficiency, didn't like delays, and certainly didn't like custody cases that didn't resolve themselves quickly. But something about today's case slowed him down. Maybe it was the way Thomas kept glancing at his watch instead of his daughter. Or the way Eva hadn't spoken a single word since arriving. Not a peep. Most children in these proceedings cried or clung to someone. Eva simply stared at the floor, her fingers twisting the hem of her oversized dress. There was no outburst, no sobs, no plea for mommy or daddy. Just silence. And even Judge Harlan, who prided himself on ignoring theatrics, noticed it. The courtroom continued its mechanical march. Exhibit C was entered. Witness statements were summarized. The guardian leaned over to clarify a point, and the father muttered under his breath about being misunderstood. Still, Eva said nothing. When the judge asked if anyone had further evidence to present, both attorneys exchanged glances and nodded that they were ready for deliberation. Harlan leaned back slightly, rubbing his temple as he considered the future of a girl who hadn't even been spoken to. The file said she liked coloring and stuffed bears. That she had trouble sleeping in unfamiliar places. That she didn't talk much. The last note in her psychological evaluation read, "Withdrawn but observant. Exhibits signs of emotional detachment and food insecurity." But Judge Harlan had read thousands of reports. They blurred together after a while. He closed the folder with a snap and prepared to deliver a ruling that would alter the course of a life he hadn't even made eye contact with. Then the bailiff opened the door to allow a late-arriving court monitor to slip in, breaking the rhythm. Judge Harlan scowled at the disruption. But the moment passed, and he cleared his throat to proceed. He began to speak, his tone clipped and final. In the matter of custody concerning Eva Granger, the court finds, but the sound of shuffling paper in the gallery cut him off. It was Eva. She'd moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, and now sat upright, her small shoulders tense. Her eyes darted around the room for the first time. Harlan paused, unsure why her movement drew his attention now when she'd been still all morning. But he said nothing, continuing. "The child shall be placed." His voice faltered for half a breath, a strange unease rippling through him. Maybe it was the room's chill. Maybe it was the way Eva's hands were now folded tightly over her stomach. No one else noticed. The attorneys continued scribbling. The guardian tapped her pen. The court kept functioning. But for some reason, Harlan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, not legally, but viscerally. He'd ruled on hundreds of similar cases. But this courtroom, this morning, felt different. He didn't know yet that a simple sentence would soon rupture the sterile order of his courtroom like a thunderclap. But the seed of it had already been planted, nestled quietly in the center of the room, inside the smallest person there. All it needed was a voice. And that voice would come. The courtroom had returned to a murmur of procedural normalcy, but within that structure, Eva's silence continued to echo like a ghost only a few could sense. Her mouth hadn't opened once since entering the building, and no one had attempted to coax it open. Even the caseworker sitting beside her, a woman named Brenda with tired eyes and a half-hearted smile, had stopped trying. Brenda had too many cases, too little time, and had learned that quiet kids were the easiest to manage. But Judge Harlan, though trained to overlook distractions, was beginning to feel the pressure of Eva's silence in a way he couldn't articulate. It was not disobedient or sulking. It was heavy, intentional. Like a question left unanswered in the middle of a sentence. Her small hands gripped each other tighter in her lap, white-knuckled, and her lips moved slightly, though no sound escaped them. The back and forth of legal arguments flowed around her like a language from another planet. People talking about her but never to her, each one assuming that silence meant agreement or acceptance, when in reality, it was neither. Thomas Granger leaned forward, attempting to look engaged as his attorney outlined his newly remodeled apartment, his steady job at a local car dealership, and his plans to enroll Eva in a nearby public school. But nothing in his demeanor suggested emotional investment, only the nervousness of someone who wanted to look good on paper. He hadn't once asked to approach Eva, hadn't tried to wave or smile or even meet her gaze. His eyes wandered the room when he wasn't being spoken to, flicking toward the clock on the wall like he had somewhere better to be. Across from him, the guardian ad litem, Ms. Rourke, watched him with quiet judgment. She had noted his absence during key developmental moments, the unanswered calls to social workers, the failed visits, and the last-minute flurry of activity that only seemed to appear when custody became a winnable prize. But even she, with her thorough reports and clinical assessments, failed to acknowledge the girl directly. No one had asked Eva what she wanted. No one had noticed the way she stared at the judge like she was trying to memorize his face, like he was the final vote in a reality she didn't understand but was forced to live in. Judge Harlan tapped the end of his pen against his lower lip, his eyes scanning the written testimonies, yet his thoughts drifting. Something about this felt off, not procedurally, not legally, but morally. The silence in the room was not due to decorum or the formality of law. It was the silence of a child who had been taught, intentionally or not, that her voice did not matter. And for a man who had made a career out of detachment, who prided himself on not being moved by theatrics, it was a deeply unsettling realization. He tried to redirect his attention to the facts. The father had a job. The apartment was adequate. There were no current charges or open investigations. From a legal standpoint, he had no grounds to deny custody. But then, there were those other details the law wasn't always built to hold. A social worker's note that Eva had gone 3 nights in a row without a meal in her last foster home. A brief mention of her hoarding crackers in her backpack. Her refusal to eat at school unless someone else opened the food first. These weren't official disqualifiers, but they were warning bells. Bells that, until now, Harlan had been trained to mute. Outside the courthouse windows, clouds began to thicken, casting the room in a grayer light. Eva shifted again, subtle but noticeable, and Harlan's eyes flicked toward her. She looked smaller than she had at the beginning of the session, as if the weight of the room had compressed her body into itself. Brenda reached into her purse, pulled out a half-eaten granola bar, and without speaking, offered it to the girl. Eva didn't take it. She didn't even look at it. She continued staring at the bench, at the man who held her future in his hands. The judge's pen stopped tapping. For a fraction of a second, his eyes locked with hers. And in that sliver of connection, something unspoken passed between them, a current of mutual recognition. He'd seen that look before. Not in court. In the mirror. In old photographs buried in drawers he never opened anymore. The look of a child trying not to ask for too much. Back then, Gregory Harlan had been just a boy in a state-run facility. A boy who learned early that asking meant disappointing, that hunger was something you carried quietly. He'd promised himself then that he would become someone who didn't need anything from anyone. And he had kept that promise, for decades. But now that old hunger stirred again, not in his belly but in his memory, awakened by a girl too polite to beg. He leaned forward, ready to issue the ruling he had prepared in his mind. But the words caught in his throat. A strange sensation, guilt, hesitation, welled up in him, thick and unfamiliar. He cleared his throat, trying to shake it off. The attorneys awaited his decision. The court reporter's fingers hovered above the keys. The silence had returned, but it was no longer comfortable. Eva looked up again. This time her lips parted slightly, and the tiniest noise emerged, a whisper only the caseworker heard. Brenda turned her head, leaned in, and furrowed her brow. Then, without warning, Eva slowly stood. The creak of the wooden bench drew the room's attention. Her knees wobbled, but she remained upright. All eyes turned to her as if noticing her for the first time. And just before the judge could speak, before decorum could reassert its grip, Eva opened her mouth and changed everything. The judge's gavel had not yet fallen when Eva stood, her movement slow and tremulous, like a bird unsure if its wings could still work. All attention shifted as though someone had snapped the strings of a puppet show mid-performance. The courtroom, a place of rigid structure and predictable rhythms, suddenly felt like it had lost gravity. Her hands hung awkwardly at her sides, and her voice, when it came, was neither loud nor forceful. But it carried with it the weight of something far heavier than volume. "I'm hungry," she said. 2 words. That was all. But the simplicity of them shattered the proceedings like a hammer to glass. Gasps didn't echo immediately because it took a few seconds for the adults in the room to comprehend what had just occurred. Eva wasn't responding to a question. She wasn't reciting testimony. She was speaking, out of turn, from the heart, to no one in particular and to everyone at once. The silence that followed was deafening, and yet in that void, something primal stirred. Even Brenda, who had grown numb from years of red tape and formality, blinked in shock, her mouth parted as though she had forgotten how to speak. Judge Harlan froze mid-motion, the gavel still raised above its base, hand hovering like a statue losing its balance. His mouth was slightly open, the words of his ruling caught between his lips like a jammed printer. His stern brow furrowed deeper, not in anger but confusion, as if the air itself had shifted. The attorneys lowered their pens, and for the first time that day, both of them turned their attention fully to the girl they were supposedly advocating for. One of them opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. A courtroom that thrived on conflict, rebuttal, and objection now stood unified in silence because of the most basic human need, a child's hunger. Eva's words weren't a tantrum or a demand. They were pure truth. And that truth made everyone in the room feel suddenly, horribly small. The judge slowly lowered the gavel without striking. "Excuse me," he said, voice low, as though unsure he had heard correctly. Eva didn't repeat herself. She just looked at him, her eyes tired in a way no 6-year-old's eyes should be. Her arms wrapped around her stomach with the unconscious instinct of someone used to discomfort. Brenda finally stood, reaching out to steady the girl, but Eva stepped slightly away, not out of defiance but out of self-preservation. It was clear now she wasn't trying to cause a scene, she was trying to survive one. The bailiff shifted uneasily, awaiting instructions. Harlan's lips moved soundlessly for a second before he leaned forward, speaking more to the room than to any one person. "Has this child been fed today?" The question landed like a slap, cutting through the pretense of legal decorum and exposing the soft underbelly of the system. Brenda hesitated, eyes darting, and her voice was small when she answered. She had breakfast. I think. But we've been here since 7. We didn't expect the session to run this long. The judge's face twitched. It was not rage, not exactly, but something close. Controlled, measured, but deeply unsettled. You think, he repeated, his voice rising half a note. A child under state supervision comes into my courtroom, sits for hours without food, and no one knows if she's eaten. The question wasn't rhetorical, but no one had the courage to respond. Thomas Granger looked utterly lost, the kind of man who realized too late that he had no idea what he was doing. He cleared his throat and mumbled, I thought someone was handling that. It was the wrong thing to say. Harlan's gaze bore into him like a drill. You're seeking custody of this child, Mr. Granger. You didn't think to ask if she'd had lunch. Thomas sank back into his seat, eyes flickering toward the floor as if trying to disappear beneath it. Eva remained standing, her expression unreadable, but her posture spoke volumes. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She had stated a fact, one that made the entire courtroom, designed to discuss her life without including her, feel grotesquely inadequate. Harlan looked down at the stack of paperwork before him. Pages upon pages detailing apartment dimensions, visitation schedules, financial statements. Not one word about Eva's breakfast. Not one note about her favorite food, her bedtime routine, the sound of her laugh. His fingers curled around the edge of the bench, and for the first time in decades, he felt unfit to speak. His rulings, always so decisive, so surgically delivered, now felt like bandages on a bleeding wound no one had bothered to examine. He stood. The motion startled the room even more than Eva's words had. Recess, he said, voice low but firm. 20 minutes. Bailiff, get this child something to eat. Something warm. Now. The bailiff nodded and moved faster than anyone had seen him move in months. Eva blinked as if confused by the sudden flurry of activity surrounding her. She wasn't used to being prioritized. Brenda reached out again, and this time Eva allowed her hand to be held. The courtroom began to stir, people standing slowly, whispering. One of the attorneys asked whether the recess would delay the ruling. Harlan didn't answer. He descended from the bench, steps heavy, and walked through the door leading to his chambers without another word. Behind that closed door, Judge Harlan leaned against the wall and exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized until that moment how long he'd been holding his breath. He saw himself again in Eva, small, silent, hungry in a room of adults too distracted to notice. He remembered the taste of stale white bread, the ache in his stomach that became normal, the lesson that asking meant weakness. That moment now returned to him like a ghost clawing its way out of the past. He had spent his entire career guarding himself from feeling too much, convinced that empathy blurred justice. But now, standing in silence, he questioned whether he'd built a courtroom that protected the law at the expense of the people it was supposed to serve. Outside, the low hum of voices continued, but inside his mind, the only sound was Eva's voice, quiet and unshakable, I'm hungry. When the courtroom reconvened 20 minutes later, the energy in the room had irrevocably shifted. The usual clatter of chairs, murmured conversations, and shuffling of papers now carried an undertone of discomfort, as if everyone present had just witnessed something they weren't sure how to process. The bailiff, normally stoic, looked unusually gentle as he guided Eva back into the room, her small hands holding the remnants of a grilled cheese sandwich wrapped in a paper napkin. She walked beside Brenda with a slow, tired grace, no longer withdrawn but still wary, as if expecting the moment of warmth to vanish like a dream. Judge Harlan had not returned to the bench yet, though the attorneys had resumed their places, visibly uncertain of what came next. The silence no longer belonged to Eva. It belonged to the system that had failed her. And for the first time, that system was being forced to look at itself. Harlan entered a minute later, not in his usual brisk, commanding stride, but with a more measured pace, as though every step came with the weight of re-evaluation. His robe hung heavily around his shoulders, and his gaze didn't immediately seek out the files on his desk. Instead, his eyes went straight to Eva, who looked up at him mid-bite. Their eyes met again, and there was something different in his expression now, not authority, but acknowledgement. He took his seat slowly and let the silence settle over the room like dust. "Before we proceed," he said, voice quieter than usual, "I want to make a few things very clear." The attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Brenda looked down. Harlan folded his hands. "This court has reviewed this case for weeks. Reports, affidavits, home evaluations. But in all that time, no one, myself included, bothered to ask the child at the center of it how she's doing. That is not acceptable." His words hung there, not grandstanding, but heavy with implication. "It's easy to focus on process," he continued, "on who qualifies for custody, on which box has been ticked and which hasn't. But a child is not a spreadsheet. And hunger is not a legal technicality." The courtroom was dead silent. Even the stenographer had paused briefly, then resumed typing, her fingers now moving with a kind of reverence. Harlan turned to Thomas Granger, who squirmed in his seat. "You want custody of this girl. But in the 6 hours you've sat here, you've not once asked if she was okay. You've never addressed her directly. You've never even offered her comfort." Thomas opened his mouth as if to protest, but Harlan held up a hand to silence him. "It's not just you. It's all of us. We're so used to cases moving through this building like numbers in a ledger that we forget they're built on the backs of people. Especially the smallest ones." At that moment, Ms. Rourke stood and cleared her throat. "Your Honor, if I may, I would like to formally request an emergency review of the child's current care conditions. I believe we've uncovered potential neglect not just in the father's application, but in the foster care oversight as well." Harlan nodded gravely. "Motion noted. And granted." Brenda paled slightly, her professional mask cracking for the first time. She was not malicious, just overwhelmed, another cog in a machine too large to see all its broken parts. Harlan addressed her next, his tone softer but firm. "Ms. Dillard, I understand your caseload is excessive, and I'm not here to vilify you. But Eva went hungry today. And it's not the first time, is it?" Brenda shook her head, her voice breaking as she replied, "No, Your Honor. She's had issues in 3 previous homes. Food hiding, missed meals, signs of hoarding. We filed the reports. We flagged the notes. But the placements kept coming. There just weren't better options." That statement, meant to explain, only deepened the ache in the room. Not enough options. Not enough care. Not enough anything. A child lost in a sea of bureaucracy. Harlan leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment before looking directly at Eva again. "Do you mind if I ask you something?" he said. Eva nodded slowly. "When you said you were hungry, was that because you missed lunch today? Or, is that something you feel a lot?" Eva blinked. Her little shoulders rose and fell. "A lot," she whispered. And that one word landed like a meteor. A lot. Not just today. Not just in this courtroom. But in the days before, and the days before that. Harlan didn't speak again for a long moment. He simply nodded, then turned to the room like a man making a decision not just for a case, but for a conscience. "I will not be issuing a final custody decision today," he said. Audible gasps followed from both attorneys. "Instead, I'm ordering an immediate hold on placement, and I'm requesting an independent child advocate to be appointed within 48 hours. Additionally, this court will be issuing a formal inquiry into the foster placement records and the Child Welfare Agency's procedural handling of this case." His words were calm, but carried the force of a tidal wave. "I may be bound by the law, but I am not blind to injustice. And I refuse to allow this courtroom to be the final stop on a conveyor belt of negligence." No one dared interrupt him. This child deserves more than legal eligibility. She deserves humanity. Eva didn't smile, but her fingers slowly released the napkin in her hand, letting it fall to the floor. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was the first sign of ease. A signal that for the first time in a very long time, someone had actually listened. The court's gears had finally ground to a halt, not because of an objection, but because of a little girl's truth. And in that moment, it was clear, justice hadn't failed her yet. It had simply been waiting to remember what it was for. The courtroom emptied slowly, hesitantly, as if the people inside were unsure whether they had just witnessed a proceeding or a revelation. Attorneys packed their briefcases with quiet hands, the clerks shuffled papers with less urgency than usual, and even Brenda moved like someone who had realized too late that she'd been part of a story she didn't fully understand. But Judge Gregory Harlan remained seated behind the bench long after the others had gone, staring not at the files, nor the flag behind him, but at a fixed point on the wall that only he seemed to see. He looked as though he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere not wrapped in oak panels and gold seals, but buried in the dust of memory. His fingers traced the edge of the bench, the wood familiar beneath his touch, and yet it felt colder now. Less like a place of power, and more like a barrier he had built to protect something deeply fragile inside himself. He didn't speak for several minutes, not even to the bailiff when asked if he was ready to return to chambers. The courtroom was silent once more, but this time it wasn't Eva's silence that filled the room. It was his. When he finally stood, the stiffness in his back betrayed how long he'd sat with his thoughts. He stepped down from the bench slowly, methodically, and made his way to a small side hallway that led not to his chambers, but to a room rarely used, a small witness recess room, typically reserved for victims and minors. Inside, Eva sat alone at a low table, her sandwich long finished, a juice box now half empty beside her. She was tracing invisible lines on the tabletop with one finger, lost in thought but not asleep. When she noticed him in the doorway, she didn't jump or flinch. She simply looked at him as if she'd been expecting him all along. Harlan approached quietly and took a seat across from her, feeling strangely unsure of what to say. He had spoken in courtrooms for decades, ruled on thousands of cases, and had never once felt tongue-tied in front of a defendant, a lawyer, or a jury. But in front of this small girl with hollow cheeks and ancient eyes, he felt like a student who had forgotten his lines. "Eva," he began, voice rough, "do you mind if I sit here for a minute?" She nodded once, barely perceptible, and continued tracing her invisible patterns. He folded his hands on the table and looked at them as if they might offer guidance. "I don't know if anyone's ever told you this, but when I was your age, I was hungry too. Not all the time, but enough times to remember." She didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. That was enough. "I used to wait until the lunch line at school got short so I wouldn't get stared at for going back for seconds. I knew which janitors would slip me half a sandwich when the cafeteria closed. And I always made sure to say thank you, like that would make it less embarrassing." His voice cracked, just slightly, but he didn't stop. "I told myself if I ever got out of that place, I'd never ask anyone for anything again. I thought needing something made you weak. But it doesn't. It makes you honest." Eva's eyes narrowed just a bit, not in anger but curiosity. "Did you live in a group home too?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. He nodded. "3 of them, before I was 12. None of them bad, exactly. Just busy, overcrowded, loud. You learn to be quiet so you don't get in trouble." She nodded slowly. That rhythm, that code, they both knew it. He studied her face, the way it stayed still when she listened, the way her hands didn't move unless they had a task. She was surviving in the only way she knew how. "You were brave today," he said after a pause. "What you said in court, people don't usually talk like that. Adults included." Eva blinked once, then shrugged. "I was just hungry." He smiled sadly. "I know. That's what made it brave." He sat with her a little longer, watching her trace another invisible design, this time in circles. "Do you know what's going to happen next?" she asked suddenly. He hesitated. "Not yet. But I promise it's going to involve people listening to you a lot more." She nodded again, this time more assured, and for a flicker of a second, her lips pulled into the beginning of a smile. It didn't last, but it was there. And for Harlan, that was enough to light a spark in a part of him he'd left cold for far too long. He stood slowly. "I'll see you soon, Eva." She gave a small wave, and he turned to leave, carrying with him something he hadn't felt in decades, accountability, not to the law, but to a child's truth. Back in his chambers, Harlan sat heavily at his desk and opened a drawer that hadn't seen daylight in years. Inside was an old leather-bound notebook, its corners frayed, its cover faded. He opened to the first page, where his younger self had written something in blocky, determined letters. Don't forget what it felt like. He had forgotten. Or rather, he had buried it so deep beneath court transcripts and legal precedent that it had fossilized. But today, Eva had cracked the stone wide open. He picked up a pen, and beneath that old sentence, he added a new one. Remember what it means to feel. Outside his door, the courthouse buzzed with new arrivals and old cases, with the daily drone of people moving paper. But inside, for the first time in decades, something was changing. Not just in a ruling. Not just in a case. But in a man who had, without realizing it, built an entire life around the absence of feeling, until a little girl's hunger reminded him of his own. The final session resumed the next morning, but it might as well have been a different courtroom altogether. The chairs were the same, the gavel unchanged, the state seal unaltered, but the air felt different, as though every breath taken within those four walls now carried the weight of revelation. Word of the previous day's proceedings had spread beyond the courthouse, whispered in legal circles and printed in early editions of the morning papers. Little girl brings courtroom to a standstill with 3 words, one headline read. But behind the spectacle, something deeper was stirring. A recognition that the system had looked past the most vulnerable person in the room, and that she had found a way to make it look back. Judge Harlan entered without his usual haste, the robe still draped over him like a curtain between past and present, but now with a subtle shift in posture, as if he carried more than just legal authority, he carried personal responsibility. His eyes scanned the room and paused on Eva, who sat at the edge of the gallery beside a new advocate appointed overnight by emergency order. This time, she wasn't alone. And this time, everyone noticed her. There was no chatter before the hearing began, no hushed jokes between lawyers, no casual rustling of papers. The room was solemn, not because of drama but because of clarity. Harlan called the session to order and asked both attorneys to approach. He didn't ask for opening remarks or procedural updates. He didn't read from a prepared statement. Instead, he looked at Thomas Granger, then at Ms. Rourke, and finally at the newly assigned child advocate. Before we continue with any motions, he said, I would like to speak directly to the child, on record. A soft wave of surprise rippled through the room. Eva looked at her advocate, who nodded gently. She stepped forward, slowly, clutching a small plush rabbit someone had given her that morning. Harlan leaned forward slightly, the stern lines of his face now carrying something softer beneath them. Eva, he said, I know you've been asked a lot of questions lately, and not all of them made sense. But I want to ask you something different. Not about the law. About you. Is that okay? Eva nodded. If you could choose anything about where you lived next, what would matter most to you? Eva looked at the floor for a moment, then at her rabbit, and finally up at the judge. I want to feel safe, she said simply. And I want to eat when I'm hungry. Her words weren't dramatic, but they cut through the room like a blade. Harlan nodded slowly. That's a very good answer, he said. And do you feel safe right now? She looked at her advocate, then at the judge again. A little more than yesterday. A quiet hum of emotion swelled in the gallery, a subtle exhale from people who hadn't realized they were holding their breath. Harlan dismissed her gently back to her seat and turned to the room. We spend so much time here trying to determine what's in the best interest of the child, he began, but often that phrase becomes a placeholder, a convenient way to move the case along without ever fully understanding the child's actual interest. He paused, letting that admission hang like a challenge. Yesterday, Eva reminded us of something the law tends to forget, that justice isn't about perfection, it's about humanity. And humanity is often quiet, inconvenient, and painfully simple. He looked again at Thomas Granger. Mr. Granger, I have reviewed your application in full, and while I acknowledge your recent efforts to stabilize your life, I cannot ignore the emotional detachment and lack of awareness you've shown throughout these proceedings. Custody is not a reward for improvement. It is a responsibility earned through presence and compassion. He turned to Ms. Rourke. Your observations have been thorough, but I'm directing you to expand your scope beyond compliance checklists. The next recommendation from your office should reflect this child's emotional well-being, not just logistical viability. Then to the advocate, you will have full access to Eva's previous placements, medical and school records, and any contact with her biological relatives, if applicable. You are to report to this court weekly for the next month with updates, not summaries. I want to know what she eats, how she sleeps, and whether she laughs. The courtroom was stunned into deeper silence, not out of fear, but reverence. They were witnessing something rare, an official making space for the unofficial truths that statistics never capture. Finally, Harlan closed the folder before him and said, "Therefore, in light of the above, the court is placing a temporary hold on custody assignments. Eva will remain in transitional care with oversight by her advocate until a full emotional and environmental assessment is completed. This decision is not permanent, but it is firm. Because this child deserves more than legal closure. She deserves a beginning, not an end." As he finished, there was no applause. No outbursts. Just a thick stillness, the kind that follows transformation. Eva leaned into her advocate's side, not to hide, but to rest. The system had paused, for her. And somehow, even if just for today, that was enough. As people began to file out, Harlan remained seated once more, the robe suddenly feeling like armor he no longer needed. He reached for his pen and jotted down something in the margin of Eva's file. She reminded me why this chair matters. He wasn't sure who would ever read it. Maybe no one. But he knew he had to write it. Behind him, the courtroom lights began to dim. He rose to leave, then paused as a soft voice echoed from the hallway. "Eva. Judge." He turned. She stood near the door, clutching her rabbit. "Will you still be here if I come back?" The question hit him harder than any argument he'd heard in court. "Yes," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'll be here." She smiled, a real one this time, and disappeared around the corner. But her question lingered. Not just for him. For everyone.